The 10,160th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Maintenance of Peace and Security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Finland, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Khalid Kiari, Assistant Secretary General, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite Her Excellency Ms. Hida Samson, Chargé d'Affaires ad interim of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor.
Mr. President, with your permission, I will make some brief remarks, and the Assistant Secretary General Chiari will provide a detailed briefing. Mr. President, Excellencies, allow me to make a direct appeal. The large-scale strikes launched by the Russian Federation across Ukraine on 23rd, 24th of May, and the prospect of further such attacks underscore the gravity of this moment. Since February 2022, more than 15,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine, nearly 800 children among them, as verified by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Reports from the Russian Federation indicated also a growing number of civilian casualties, including children. Humanitarian personnel have come under attack. Serious violations of international humanitarian law continue. The human toll is increasing. In the first 4 months of this year, more civilians have been killed in Ukraine than in the same period in 2025, or 2024, or 2023. The front line is virtually frozen, with swarms of drones inflicting heavy casualties, and civilian infrastructure is being destroyed on a vast scale, especially energy infrastructure. This could go on and on and on. But the direction of the war, the escalation and the intensification that we are witnessing, risks to get out of control. The risk of miscalculation, the risk of escalation with unknown and unintended consequences. And so let's speak plainly. The current course is not sustainable. The trajectory must change. The death spiral must stop. What is needed now is de-escalation, immediate and sustained. What is needed now is a full and unconditional ceasefire. What is needed now is more diplomacy. And what is needed is to create the conditions for a just, lasting and comprehensive peace in line with the Charter of the United Nations, international law and UN resolution. Mr. President, Excellencies, the choice is clear, the responsibility is clear, the time for peace is now, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Khalid Kiari.
Mr. President, as the Secretary General just stated, today's meeting takes place against the backdrop of an alarming escalation of the war in Ukraine. On the night of 23rd and 24th of May, the armed forces of the Russian Federation launched a massive strike across Ukraine, reportedly deploying as many as 90 long-range missiles and 600 drones. Among the weapons used was the so-called Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile, which targeted the city of Bila Tserkva in central Ukraine. This marks the third known instance of the use of this weapon by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. At least 5 people were reported killed and at least 112 others injured across Ukraine, with the heaviest toll in Kyiv. The city's more than 2 million residents endured over 7 hours of explosions, impacting dozens of residential buildings. According to UNESCO, more than 30 cultural sites were reportedly damaged in this latest wave of attacks. The diplomatic residence of the Albanian ambassador and the compound housing the United Nations Resident Coordinator and several UN agencies were impacted by falling debris from strikes in central Kyiv. Fortunately, no UN staff members were injured. Attacks continued into this week, impacting civilians across southern and eastern Ukraine. Russian Federation authorities have also reported rising civilian casualties from alleged Ukrainian strikes. On 25th of May, 2 civilians were reportedly killed in the Belgorod and Bryansk regions. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned over the recent announcement by the Russian Federation of plans to conduct, and I quote, consistent and systemic strikes against Ukrainian defense enterprises in Kyiv, as well as against decision-making centers and command posts, end of quote. This announcement followed reports of an Ukrainian drone attack on a college building and dormitory in the Ukrainian city of Starobilsk that is presently occupied by the Russian Federation. We strongly condemn all attacks on civilian and civilian infrastructure. Such attacks, wherever they occur, violate international humanitarian law. They must cease immediately. Civilians must be protected. Mr. President, the United Nations and our humanitarian partners continue to operate under extremely dangerous conditions to reach civilians in need. In the past 2 weeks, United Nations humanitarian personnel, humanitarian partners, and assets have come under attack on 5 occasions. This is unacceptable. Humanitarian personnel and clearly marked humanitarian missions must be protected at all times in accordance with international humanitarian law. The United Nations stands ready to work with both sides to ensure safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access to communities in need, wherever they may be. Despite the challenging conditions, the United Nations continue to support recovery and reconstruction efforts, as well as human rights monitoring and advocacy. The United Nations is also focused on efforts to facilitate the safe return of deported and forcibly transferred Ukrainian children, including through the Secretary General's Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict. Mr. President, in its 5th year, Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine continues to exact a profound toll, disrupting global trade and economy, deepening regional and international divisions, and eroding trust in the multilateral system. With each passing day, diplomacy is delayed. The threat to regional and international peace and security deepens. An urgent return to dialogue and negotiations remain imperative. The United Nations will continue to fully support all meaningful efforts to that end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank the Secretary General for his presence and his introduction, and ASG Chiari for his factual briefing. Today, the Council meets again to condemn a new level of atrocities and other violations of international law by Russian Federation, worse with every time. On 23rd, 24th of May, Russia launched the largest ever combined missile attack against Kyiv. In this massive assault, Russia attacked Ukrainian civilians with over 90 missiles, including 36 ballistic weapons, one of them Oreshnik, nuclear-capable hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile, and 600 attack drones. Russia's barbaric, indiscriminate strikes killed at least 4 people and injured more than 100 others. Russia deliberately and knowingly wages a war against civilians. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, from January to April 2026, Russia killed at least 815 civilians and injured 4,174. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, this Council has held more than 100 meetings on Russia's aggression against Ukraine. To date, more than 213,200 potential war crimes have been registered, from unlawful deportations, executions, to systematic and widespread torture and conflict-related sexual violence. As a matter of example, last year in Kherson region alone, drone attacks caused around 2,200 civilian casualties. Mr. President, amongst the so-called military targets last weekend were also 350 residential buildings. The building of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the residence of the Ambassador of Albania, a building housing several UN agencies, a number of cultural and historic sites, including National Philharmonic, the Dynamo Football Stadium, and the Chernobyl Museum. That museum, just opened after renovation, is dedicated to preserving the historical memory of the biggest tragedy caused by Soviet Union's utter disregard for human life. This is the same disregard for human life that Russia demonstrates today. Even if the museum building is gone, the memory of those crimes then, as well as the atrocities committed by Russia now, will not be forgotten. To add to this list, just yesterday, a children's playground in Kherson region was attacked, killing the father, injuring the mother and her 3- and 6-year-old daughters. The mother is in critical condition in the hospital. She has 2 more children, who luckily were not at the playground that day. Which one of these atrocities qualifies as a legitimate military target? Mr. President, Russia continues to attack the UN system and UN personnel, not only rhetorically, but literally. While the world has been calling for a ceasefire, Russia has rejected at least 7 peace or ceasefire proposals last year alone. Still, Latvia continues to call for an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire. Russia cannot win this war on the battlefield. In 2026, it is more visible than ever. No territorial gains, increasing reports on net losses, staggering rate of military casualties, and equipment destroyed. Its model of war is going nowhere. Russia has turned itself into the ultimate architect of its own economic, intellectual, and societal decline. It has decided to escalate its long-standing narrative of victimhood, lies, and conspiracies. Unable to win this war, Russia takes the path of threats and intimidation, and it is a path of self-destruction. Most recently, on 25th of May, Russia issued another threat, calling on foreign citizens, including the personnel of diplomatic missions, to leave Kyiv due to plans to carry out more strikes. Russia's threats will not intimidate us. We are not leaving Kyiv. Our diplomats will continue their work. It is Russia that must leave the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Mr. President, Ukraine will survive. Ukraine will overcome. And Ukraine will thrive despite Russia's aggression. Ukrainian innovation and technology are cutting edge. Ukraine's economy is resilient. And the strength and will of the Ukrainian people is unbreakable. Let me give you one more vivid example. Over that weekend, a newly opened coffee shop in Kyiv was damaged by Russia's strikes. It was just newly opened. But the coffee machine still worked. So the owners cleared the rubble and customers lined up for morning coffee. This is the Ukrainian spirit, the spirit of courage, the spirit of freedom, the spirit of not giving up, no matter how tired they are. Russia's intimidation, including threats of the use of force, will not weaken our resolve, and we continue to stand united with Ukraine against the illegal aggression. It is time to accept the Russian Empire is in the past and nothing will bring it back. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank Secretary General Guterres for his presence and powerful appeal, and Assistant Secretary Chiari for his briefing here today. Mr. President, for the third time in 10 days, this Council has convened to urgently address the humanitarian suffering caused by Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion of its peaceful neighbor, Ukraine. Denmark strongly condemns Russia's deadly mass casualty airstrikes on Kyiv and other population centers across Ukraine on May 24th. It was the most intense aerial attack Kyiv has endured since the beginning of the war. We are shocked and horrified by Russia's actions and extend our condolences to the latest civilian victims of this illegal war. These attacks represent yet another dramatic escalation. Military weapons with terrible destructive powers, including hypersonic missile and nuclear-capable intermediate-range ballistic missiles, were unleashed, resulting in large-scale civilian casualties. Mr. President, for the third time in just 10 days, Denmark demands that international humanitarian law be fully respected, without exception, and similarly demands, also without exception, full accountability and justice for all the crimes committed in this war of choice launched by Russia. Fundamental principles of international humanitarian law are distinction, proportionality, precaution, and military necessity. At their most basic, they demand the elementary consideration of humanity to limit and, if possible, avoid civilian harm. Instead, we have seen the exact opposite: another Russian attack on Ukraine's cities with more than 100 casualties. Russia claims that it only conducts high-precision strikes exclusively on military targets. And let me name a few of these so-called military targets damaged or destroyed by Russia's attacks on 24th May. Dozens of residential buildings, a metro center being used as an air raid shelter, a school, a supermarket, and many important cultural institutions. UN experts have independently verified that Russia's full-scale invasion has so far killed and injured over 60,000 Ukrainian civilians, including more than 3,500 children. The true figures are likely much higher. Mr. President, last week, Russia openly threatened military aggression against a fellow council member. Now the Kremlin has threatened systematic attacks on Kyiv and demanded that international staff, including diplomats and humanitarian aid workers, leave the country. An admission that no sites, whether embassies or international humanitarian aid storages or convoys, are off limits to Russia's armed forces. Such threats are outrageous and cannot be tolerated. Mr. President, Ukraine has been offering an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire for well over a year. During that time, UN experts have told us that Russia's attacks on Ukrainian civilians have dramatically escalated. Russia's escalating attacks on civilians, its nuclear saber-rattling, threats against other peaceful neighbors, and now against diplomats and international aid workers in Ukraine are signs of desperation in the face of unsustainable battlefield losses and massive economic headwinds. In closing, Mr. President, President Putin's illegal invasion to remove Ukraine's democratically elected leaders and redraw internationally recognized borders by force has failed. Ukraine has resisted resolutely. The only solution is a permanent ceasefire to allow for good faith negotiations aimed at a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. The longer Russia denies reality, the longer civilians will suffer. The international community must continue to pressure Russia to halt its invasion. Until that moment, Denmark reaffirms its steadfast support to Ukraine along with our partners. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting on the emergency situation in Ukraine yet once again. I would like to first of all thank the Secretary General for being here and for the report which recalls the basic principles of the organization, which launches an appeal which we support a comprehensive ceasefire. I also would like to thank the Assistant Secretary General Chiari. I thank him for his statement which confirms a further escalation of violence by Russia in the fifth year of its war of aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, while the Russian army has been stalling for months on the front line, the Russian authorities have officially announced at the highest level a massive increase in their strikes on the Ukrainian capital, which has already been heavily hit since 2022. With nearly 600 drones and 90 missiles, the latest attack killed at least 4 people and wounded nearly 100 during the night of May 23rd to 24th. Many civilian buildings, many of which are part of the Ukrainian cultural and intellectual life, were affected. The National Museum of Fine Arts, for example, the Chernobyl Museum, the National Academy of Music, the Philharmonic Opera House, the National Library, several universities, and others. In addition to these cultural venues, which are places of identity and memory, a wastewater treatment plant, a vital civilian infrastructure, was also hit. Other regions have also been targeted, including Kharkiv, Odessa, Sumy, and Zhytomyr. While the members of this council were denouncing last week the drone strikes on an OCHA humanitarian convoy in Kherson, a new missile strike targeted a World Food Program warehouse in Dnipro, destroying food that was to be distributed to 130,000 people. Finally, and for the third time since the beginning of its full-scale war in 2022, Russia has used the Oreshnik ballistic missile, which has a nuclear payload capacity, and everyone can see the reference under this fact. Mr. President, the escalation demonstrates the impasse in which Russia is trapped, refusing to engage in peace negotiations while Ukraine continues to repel its assaults on the ground, and while such negotiations have been offered, Russia is trying to compensate for its failures on the front line with further relentlessness on the Ukrainian capital against its population and humanitarian organizations working on the ground. This new Russian attempt to make a country bend by targeting civilian population and vital infrastructure contravenes the Geneva Convention. France denounces this new irresponsible escalation, and we pay tribute to the Ukrainian people, and we reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine. Mr. President, France condemns Russia's unacceptable threats against Ukrainian civilians and against the diplomatic representations and international organizations present in Ukraine, as was expressed by the Russian Foreign Ministry and relayed by the permanent representative of Russia several days ago. This was assumed and claimed by the Russian side, and these threats are in flagrant contravention of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and international humanitarian law, and are absolutely unacceptable, especially coming from a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. These statements do not in any way exempt Russia from respecting its international obligations. In solidarity with Ukraine since day one, France will maintain its embassy and its diplomatic staff in Kiev, and I would like to salute our fellow diplomats serving in Ukraine. We are proud of you, and you have our full support. Mr. President, another path is possible. France calls on Russia to desist from this irresponsible escalation. It calls on them to engage in good faith in peace negotiations, the first step of which must be an immediate, comprehensive, and unconditional ceasefire, as proposed yet once again by the UN Secretary General and supported by the vast majority of member states. France, together with its partners, is ready to get involved in this journey and remains committed to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank France for the statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Mr. President, We welcome the Secretary General and thank him for his sobering remarks, and we also thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. Mr. President, the third meeting of this Council on Ukraine within 10 days is in itself proof enough of the need for concerted efforts to end this war. It is regrettable that we are experiencing new levels of escalation owing to Russia's latest unwarranted and unjustified acts of aggression. Russia's attacks against Kiev and its surrounding areas of last week, one of the largest combined air attacks against the Ukrainian capital since the beginning of the full-scale war, is a case in point. The massive and sustained nature of these attacks, as well as the weapons and methods used, seem to imply that the purpose was to inflict as much damage and suffering as possible in the middle of an urban, civilian-populated area and to directly impact Ukrainian morale. Over the past 3 days, hostilities and attacks across Ukraine have killed or injured more than 240 civilians, including many children, and those attacks have also damaged schools, energy infrastructure, and agricultural assets. We deplore the civilian casualties sustained by these attacks. We also deplore that more than 10 cultural institutions and 2 educational and research facilities were severely damaged in Kiev, and we join UNESCO's in condemnation of any attacks against cultural property. In the same vein, we are deeply concerned over the damages sustained by diplomatic premises in Kiev. The announcement by the Russian MFA on the 25th of May 2026 calling on foreign citizens, including the personnel of diplomatic missions and international organizations, to leave Kiev due to plans to carry out strikes is unacceptable. We call on Russia to abstain from such warnings or threats against diplomatic institutions and embassies in Kiev, in full respect of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. In that regard, we reiterate that Greece condemns any attacks against civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel wherever they may occur. We also wish to remind that protection of civilians in armed conflict is absolute, unconditional, and non-negotiable, and that compliance with international humanitarian law is not optional. We deplore any life lost and that adds to the suffering of this conflict and call for full accountability and justice for the victims. Mr. President, we are mindful that, as Russia claims, these attacks were expressly conducted as retaliation against a deliberate strike against a school in Luhansk last week. As deliberated also in this Council, we are once again asking for access of the relevant UN agencies to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, which will ensure independent verification of such incidents. Mr. President, there are high risks of both vertical and horizontal escalation in this war, which need to be contained and reversed, not only to end the human suffering in Ukraine, but also to restore respect and trust to international law and the principles of the UN Charter, which all of the new UN member states have agreed to uphold. As the Secretary General said in this chamber 2 days ago, violence in Ukraine is expanding in scale and complexity. Russia's repeated use of new destructive weapons, such as the Orange-Stick medium-range ballistic missile with its nuclear capabilities, as well as the aggressive rhetoric against other neighboring states, threaten to expand the already catastrophic consequences of this war. It is thus clear to us that the need for an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire, which will allow for the resumption of diplomacy, has never been more urgent. We view this as a necessary step towards achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. that will be firmly based on international law and the UN Charter and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, rejecting any change of borders as a result of the use of force. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of UK.
Thank you, President. I thank the Secretary-General and ASG Chiari for briefing us today. The United Kingdom supported Ukraine in calling for today's meeting. Colleagues, last Friday, Russia asked this Council to meet following an alleged incident in occupied Luhansk, which UN briefers said they had not been able to verify because Russia refuses access to Ukrainian territory which it occupies. The very next day, Russia launched one of its largest attacks on Kyiv since the start of the full-scale invasion. These strikes caused widespread damage to civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, schools, emergency service facilities, Ukrainian government buildings, and cultural institutions. These are not just buildings. They sustain essential services and underpin communities. They are people's homes. So far this month, Russian attacks have killed nearly 200 civilians and injured over 1,500 more. May is on track to see the most civilian casualties in Ukraine since the early days of Russia's full-scale invasion. This weekend also marked the third time Russia has deployed an Oreshnik missile, the first time in Kyiv Oblast. Russia's use of this nuclear-capable system in urban environments is brazen and reckless. We are also deeply concerned by reports that diplomatic sites in Kyiv were struck, including UN premises and a residential complex housing the Albanian ambassador. And Russia followed up its attack with threats to diplomats to leave the city, warning of another barrage. Russia attempts to project strength through mass attacks, then comes to this chamber and plays the victim. But the truth is that Moscow's escalating attacks against civilians betray its weakness. Russia is desperate because it is going backwards on the battlefield. New intelligence shows that almost 500,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the conflict began, while Ukraine still stands firm. Russia's war is failing, so Moscow is resorting to escalation and intimidation. Security Council members have been clear that we need peace, but such peace cannot be achieved while Russia continues its campaign against Ukraine's people. Russia's escalating attacks do nothing to bring us closer to a peaceful outcome, nor do they bring Russia any closer to achieving Putin's war aims. As the Secretary-General said, an immediate, comprehensive ceasefire is essential. I thank you.
I thank the United Kingdom for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we thank the Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, and Assistant Secretary-General Khaled Chiari for their valuable contributions. We recognize the participation of the distinguished delegations that are joining us today. Mr. President, today the Security Council is meeting for the third time in the space of a month to address the intensification of the conflict in Ukraine. We regret the fact that calls for a cessation of hostilities expressed in this Council have not been heeded by the parties involved in this conflict. On the contrary, as the Secretary-General said on Tuesday during the open debate on the strengthening of the Charter of the United Nations, global military spending has reached unprecedented levels, while lethal arms are becoming easier to access. The vast majority of the members here present have urged the resumption of conversations that would allow for moving towards a negotiated and lasting political solution, one that could put an end to this conflict in accordance with the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Just the day before yesterday, in the open debate, we referred to the commitment that all of the members of this organization made with the Charter and its principles, made to the Charter and its principles. And today, those principles need to prevail, and they must be our guide. Mr. President, Panama firmly maintains that the protection of civilians must constitute an unquestionable priority in this and in all conflicts. The protection of civilians cannot depend on political or military considerations. The recent attack against Ukraine combined around 600 drones and 90 missiles, including a hypersonic ballistic missile, which demonstrates a particularly alarming escalation in the level of violence being employed. Once again, we condemn the use of means of warfare of this magnitude against inhabited areas because of the grave humanitarian consequences that they entail and because of the risk of a further destabilization of the region. Moreover, we are concerned by damage to civilian infrastructure, the destruction of which exacerbates the impact of these attacks and jeopardizes cultural heritage, identity, and historic memory. Panama calls upon all of the parties to the conflict to commit to a sustained dialogue in good faith that could pave the way towards a genuine and firm commitment to de-escalate and to establish an immediate, lasting and verifiable ceasefire that would allow for a just and sustainable peace to be reached in Ukraine. It is the shared responsibility of this Council to work together to reduce tensions, to guarantee unrestricted access to humanitarian assistance, and to keep our commitment to human dignity. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to Secretary General Guterres, thank you, sir, and Assistant Secretary General Chiari for your remarks today. The latest mass strikes against Kyiv by Russia over the weekend, including the deployment of the Orishnik hypersonic ballistic missiles, are an inexplicable, dangerous, and barbaric escalation. They are another example of why the Russia-Ukraine war must end immediately and permanently. Once again, as you've heard from your colleagues, civilians were killed and more than 100 injured. Museums, public transportation infrastructure, residential buildings, and more were destroyed or damaged. Deliberate attacks against civilians are obscene and unacceptable. The United States extends its deepest sympathies to all those affected. We caution Russia not to mount so-called systematic strikes against Kyiv, which risk further civilian casualties and setting back the prospect of peace. We note, too, with serious concern, Russia's apparent disregard for the protections afforded to diplomatic facilities and personnel under international law. We remind Russia, in clear terms, of its legal obligations, and we add, diplomacy and negotiation are the only path forward towards lasting peace. Threats and incendiary rhetoric are clearly not part of that path. Colleagues, the Russia-Ukraine war can only end with a negotiated settlement. The United States once again calls for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire as a step towards a durable, negotiated end to the war. The alternative is escalating violence that will spiral out of control. That is unacceptable. The war must stop. The United States calls on the Russian Federation to cease, and the international community, as the international community, calls for this system to break out of this cycle. We call for de-escalation, and we continue calls for both parties to negotiate in good faith to end this war. As Secretary Rubio said earlier this week, the United States stands prepared to play a constructive role as soon as any opportunity and real commitment from both parties presents itself. We are ready to do whatever is possible to stop the death and destruction. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this emergency meeting, and I extend my greetings to the Secretary General and my thanks to Mr. Khaled Kiari, Assistant Secretary General, for the briefing presented. My greetings also to the delegations participating in today's meeting. Since we last met on Friday in this Council, we have seen another wave of attacks that continues to claim lives and to worsen the suffering of the civilian population. Far from seeing signs of restraint, we continue to witness a trend of escalation, which is exacerbating the conflict and making the prospects for peace more remote. All too often, this Council hears reports of hospitals being affected, residential buildings being struck, warehouses being destroyed, and educational facilities being impacted. It is particularly alarming that many of these actions are taking place in densely populated areas where the use of explosive weapons with a wide area of impact has devastating consequences for the civilian population. These reports cannot become the normalized practice of this conflict. And yet, here we are once again, hearing about civilian victims and about damage to civilian objects, which should be protected at all times. It is not possible to accept a logic according to which each episode of violence seems to lead to further escalations, while the civilian population and those that risk their lives to assist them continue to pay the price. For that reason, Colombia will remind this Council as many times as is necessary that international humanitarian law prohibits attacks against the civilian population and objects of a civilian nature. These acts are inadmissible and may constitute war crimes. The obligations derived from the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution are binding. They are not optional, and they are being dangerously ignored time and time again. Mr. President, my country, in addition, notes with grave concern that this escalation is not being manifested solely on the ground. We also see it in language, in narratives of confrontation, and in statements which, even in this Council, at times seem to deepen divisions instead of opening up space for diplomacy. We understand that this conflict is marked by profound differences and wounds, but the language of permanent confrontation cannot replace the language of peace. Words matter because they also can close or open the path towards dialogue and reconciliation. Mr. President, through Resolution 2774, this Council made a clear call for a rapid end to the conflict and urged for progress towards a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Today, that appeal is more urgent than ever. Therefore, Colombia reiterates its call for effective dialogue channels, for concrete confidence-building measures, and for an immediate, real, and verifiable ceasefire as a first step towards a negotiated and lasting political solution. In those efforts, the role of mediators and those that try to keep spaces for diplomacy open are more important than ever. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. I also thank Mr. Khaled Khiari, the Assistant Secretary General, for his briefing. We also welcome the delegations participating in today's meeting. Mr. President, we followed with grave concern the latest escalation in the Russian-Ukrainian war. We express our deep regret towards the escalation in violence and the increase in attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, which has led to the death and injury of a number of innocent civilians who are shouldering the biggest burden of this war that has entered its 5th year. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain calls for de-escalation. We call for dialogue and diplomacy and for supporting the efforts of a comprehensive and lasting peace. We reaffirm that political and diplomatic solutions are the optimal way to achieve peace and not a military option. We also reaffirm the need for resuming tripartite talks between the United States, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine, based on serious and responsible political will to bring perspectives together and pave the way to relaunch a constructive negotiation path that would lead to a comprehensive and sustainable peace process. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its concern regarding the increasing use of advanced and lethal weapons in wars, including drones, ballistic missiles, and other modern military methods. These are worsening the challenges related to the adherence to the rules of international humanitarian law during armed conflict, especially when it comes to distinguishing between military objects and civilian facilities, and given the danger it poses on the lives of innocent civilians. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms the importance of continued diplomatic efforts and the importance of keeping dialogue channels open. We need to make the best use of diplomatic momentum to contribute in supporting the efforts of peace. We also reaffirm the need to address the root causes of conflicts, and all security concerns of all parties should be taken into account to reach a peaceful, sustainable solution of the conflict and to guarantee security and stability in the European continent. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms its support for a comprehensive political solution that ends this destructive war in line with the principles of the UN Charter, the rules of international law, and Security Council Resolution 2774 to contribute to maintaining international peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liberia thanks the Secretary General for his presence and brief remarks, and also thank ASG Khiari for his briefing. We take the floor today not to relitigate the origins of this conflict, nor to assign blame that this Council has already assigned many times over. We take the floor because the situation on the ground has entered a phase that demands a different kind of response from us. Not louder condemnations, but more precise actions. The civilian toll is now measured in the tens of thousands. Infrastructure that entire populations depend on, power, water, medical care facilities, is being struck with regularity. Women and children are bearing disproportionate share
of the displacement, deprivation, and long-term trauma that follow these attacks. Mr. President, Liberia recognizes that this conflict carries grievances, security concerns, and historical narratives on multiple sides. We do not dismiss that complexity, but complexity is not a legal exemption. Whatever the political origins of this war, the obligations of international humanitarian law apply uniformly to every party in every engagement. Liberia, therefore, urges both parties without delay to comply fully with their obligations under international law, including the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, the facilitation of safe and sustained humanitarian access, and cooperation with credible verification and independent investigation mechanisms. With that in mind, Liberia offers 3 concrete proposals designed to function even in the absence of a ceasefire. First, a protected systems compact. The Secretary General should be mandated to maintain a live, satellite-verified registry of civilian critical infrastructure, power grids, water systems, medical facilities, humanitarian distribution sites, shared in real time with all parties. The principle is straightforward. What is visibly and verifiably protected is harder to strike with impunity. This is not a new legal obligation. It is an operational mechanism to make existing obligations more legible. Second, a civilian impact trigger. The Council should establish an automatic procedural response. Any verified incident exceeding a defined civilian casualty threshold compels a Council session within 72 hours, with a public compliance assessment from the Secretariat. Not to re-debate the war, but to ensure that mass casualty incidents do not disappear quietly or go into procedure. Visibility itself is a form of accountability. Third, a rolling restraint framework. Comprehensive ceasefire. Negotiations remain blocked. Liberia does not pretend otherwise, but we propose an incremental alternative that both parties commit to renewable 72-hour suspension of strikes on protected systems, verified by the UN, with each successful circle extended. This is not a peace agreement. It is a discipline, one that builds the habit of restraint before the conditions for peace exist. Progress does not always arrive whole. Mr. President, Liberia is a small state. We have no leverage to compel, but we have sat in this chamber and received peacekeeping forces when our own institutions failed us. And we know that it means what it means when the international system chooses engagement over abandonment. We are asking this Council to make the same choice now, not to end this war by declaration, but to constrain how it is fought, step by step, through mechanisms that are practical, reciprocal, and available today. That is what this moment requires, and Liberia will keep saying so until it is heard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Secretary General for his remarks. We also thank ASG Khalid Khiari for his comprehensive briefing. As we gather today here, our delegation remains deeply concerned by the ongoing hostilities and the continued deterioration of both humanitarian and security conditions in Ukraine. Recent developments demonstrate that the longer this conflict continues, the longer the human suffering is prolonged and the prospect for a sustainable peace is diminished. We are troubled by the continuous escalation of military actions affecting civilian and critical infrastructure. The protection of civilian infrastructure, including the preservation of schools, hospitals, and homes, are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. In this regard, we call on all parties to adhere their obligations under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we reiterate that all parties must prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and commit to immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. My delegation remains convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the only viable means to bring an end to this crisis. While we note the diplomatic tracks have reached an impasse in recent weeks, we continue to encourage international diplomatic initiatives, particularly the tripartite talks among the United States, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation. A durable and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of this conflict and be fully consistent with the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter. Lasting peace will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and shared vision of common and sustainable security. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this conflict deserve a future defined by peace, prosperity, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, President. I would like to thank Secretary General Guterres for his remarks. We, in fact, fully endorse his call for bringing this tragic conflict to an end and for a comprehensive peace through diplomacy and in line with the UN Charter. We also take note of the briefing by ASG Khalid Khiari. President, the Council is meeting for the third time in a little more than a week to deliberate on the Ukraine conflict. Now, well into its fifth year, this conflict continues to rage, leaving trail of widespread destruction and upending lives and livelihoods of millions of people. The sharp escalation in fighting witnessed recently and the resultant far-reaching humanitarian impact is alarming and deeply troubling. My delegation wishes to reiterate Pakistan's clear, consistent, and principled position on matters related to international law, including international humanitarian law, and the obligations of the concerned parties. The principles of IHL are fundamental and must be fully and consistently adhered to by all parties without exception. And let me also say that the protection of diplomatic compounds is guaranteed under international customary and treaty law, and this obligation must be scrupulously followed by all parties. President, this recent escalation demonstrates yet again the imperative of a pacific settlement of this conflict. A meaningful and earnest commitment to dialogue and diplomacy is the only way to bring lasting peace and help restore much-needed stability in this region. We reiterate that military means cannot bring lasting peace and will only prolong and further compound the agony of those affected by this conflict. And we reiterate the fundamental need for the parties to agree to an immediate and complete cessation of hostilities and provide necessary space for diplomacy to work and to bring this conflict to an early end. Pakistan has all along favored and advocated the path of dialogue and diplomacy for peaceful settlement of this conflict. This would require, in our view, commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and a focus on finding a mutually acceptable solution corresponding to the legitimate security interests of all sides and the relevant multilateral agreements. In this context, we reiterate our hope that the parties would resume participation in the US-facilitated dialogue process at the earliest. President Pakistan voted in favor of Resolution 2774 in February last year. Pakistan will continue to support all efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive, durable, and peaceful resolution of this conflict. This, we believe, must be achieved without further delay, for every passing day with continuation of hostilities only deepens the misery of the people in the region and distances the parties further from the much-needed peace. I thank you.
感谢巴基斯坦代表的发言。我现在请刚果金代表发言。
Monsieur le Président, la République démocratique du Congo vous remercie pour la convocation de la présente réunion consacrée au maintien de la paix et de la sécurité de l'Ukraine. La République démocratique du Congo remercie le secrétaire général, son Excellence M. Antonio Guterres, ainsi que le secrétaire général adjoint, Mohamed Chiari, pour leurs exposés sur l'évolution de la situation en Ukraine, lesquels nous rappellent une fois de plus la gravité de la situation sécuritaire et humanitaire, ainsi que l'urgence d'une mobilisation responsable de ce Conseil en faveur de la protection des civils, de la désescalade et de la recherche d'une paix juste, durable et crédible. La République démocratique du Congo a pris note des informations faisant état des attaques qui ont touché plusieurs villes ukrainiennes, dont Kiev, dans la nuit du 23 au 24 mai dernier, et qui ont causé d'importants dommages ainsi que des pertes en vies humaines. Elle exprime sa profonde préoccupation face à la poursuite d'une escalade militaire qui semble désormais s'inscrire dans une logique de confrontation permanente et dont les populations civiles demeurent les premières victimes. Le fait que le Conseil soit saisi une nouvelle fois de la situation en Ukraine après sa récente réunion du 22 mai est non seulement la preuve de l'intensification des hostilités, mais également la conséquence de l'enlisement progressif d'un conflit dont les conséquences deviennent chaque jour plus diffuses, plus incontrôlables et plus dévastatrices. Cette situation est inacceptable. La République démocratique du Congo est profondément préoccupée par cette spirale qui continue des frappes, des représailles et des contre-représailles qui s'apparentent à la prévalence d'une véritable logique de guerre au détriment de toute perspective de règlement politique. Cette logique, si elle s'enracine davantage, va malheureusement éloigner les perspectives d'une paix durable. Monsieur le Président, ma délégation estime que le Conseil de sécurité ne peut se limiter à constater la dégradation continue de la situation sans mesurer pleinement les responsabilités qui lui incombent au regard du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. Chaque nouvelle escalade, chaque nouvelle vague de frappe et chaque nouvelle atteinte aux civils rappelle avec acuité l'urgence d'un sursaut collectif en faveur de la désescalade et du dialogue. La République démocratique du Congo rappelle avec insistance que la protection des civils constitue une obligation fondamentale et intangible au regard du droit international humanitaire qui ne saurait être relativisé par des impératifs militaires. Aucune circonstance ne devrait conduire à l'exposition d'enfants, d'établissements scolaires, d'infrastructures civiles ou de personnel humanitaire à des attaques. C'est pourquoi Ma délégation insiste également sur la nécessité d'assurer un accès humanitaire rapide, sûr, durable et sans entrave aux populations affectées. Le personnel humanitaire, les professionnels de santé, les secouristes ainsi que les infrastructures d'urgence doivent continuer à bénéficier d'une protection effective. La République démocratique du Congo réaffirme avec constance qu'il ne saurait exister de solution durable à cette crise par la seule voie militaire. Seul un dialogue sincère, la retenue, la désescalade et un engagement résolu en faveur de la diplomatie peuvent ouvrir la voie à une paix crédible et durable. À cet égard, ma délégation exhorte toutes les parties à œuvrer activement à l'apaisement des tensions et soutient les initiatives diplomatiques et de médiation en cours, notamment celles entreprises par les États-Unis d'Amérique ainsi que par l'Union européenne. Pour conclure, Monsieur le Président, l'histoire des relations internationales enseigne que les conflits les plus douloureux ne trouvent d'issue durable ni dans l'escalade ni dans l'accumulation de souffrances, mais dans la capacité des parties à recréer les conditions minimales de confiance permettant le retour du dialogue. Tant que les hostilités se poursuivront, les perspectives d'un règlement négocié demeurent fragilisées et les souffrances des populations continuent de s'aggraver. Réaffirmant son attachement aux buts et principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, la République démocratique du Congo appelle de ce fait toutes les parties à faire preuve de retenue, à respecter strictement leurs obligations internationales et à s'abstenir de toute action susceptible d'aggraver davantage la situation sur terrain. Je vous remercie.
感谢刚果金代表的发言。我现在请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, благодарим созвавшие это заседание страны за то, что даете нам еще одну возможность для того, чтобы вновь привлечь внимание международного сообщества к тому, что произошло 22 мая. Ваша цель была, конечно, не в этом, а наоборот отвлечь внимание от трагедии в Старобельске. А на заседании прошлой пятницы ряд членов Совета Безопасности позволил себе бессовестно ссылаться на отсутствие информации. В ночь на 22 мая киевский режим вновь проявил свою террористическую сущность, нанеся варварский прицельный удар по Старобельскому педагогическому колледжу и общежитию, применив 16 БПЛА. Эта трагедия унесла жизни 21 человека, прежде всего молодых девушек, 44 человека получили ранения. Если вдруг кто-то в этом зале по-прежнему сомневается, либо не знаком с последствиями удара по Старобельску, то мы рекомендуем посмотреть видеорепортаж, который мы продемонстрировали в ходе пресс-конференции 26 мая. Приехавшие на место трагедии по приглашению российской стороны более 50 журналистов из 19 стран лично убедились в достоверности информации. Как бы ни пытался оправдываться Киев, как бы ни старались так называемые ведущие западные СМИ закрывать глаза на произошедшее, то, что случилось ночью 22 мая, это циничный террористический акт. Жестокость, с которой киевский режим расправился с детьми, можно сравнить лишь с действиями нацистов и их пособников в годы Второй мировой войны, безжалостно истреблявших мирное население. Особенно поражает лицемерие и циничная реакция делегаций европейских стран, которые обычно мгновенно выступают с обвинениями в адрес России, когда им это политически удобно. Но в данном случае предпочли фактически не заметить трагедию и возложить ответственность на Москву. Но мы не были удивлены тогда и не удивлены сейчас. О каком человеческом сострадании с их стороны может идти речь, когда кровь детей Старобельска и на их руках? Ведь их страны на протяжении многих лет снабжают террористический режим Зеленского деньгами, разведданными, оружием, боеприпасами, вдохновляют его на новые преступления против мирных жителей, а затем прикрывают его, рисуя его в роли жертвы. Секретариат ООН, столь оперативный в одних случаях, к сожалению, вновь ограничился общей риторикой и максимально обтекаемыми формулировками, уклонившись от прямой оценки действий Киева. Мол, отсутствует доступ на место трагедии, нет возможности верифицировать данные. Мы заявляли неоднократно, что представители ООН могут посещать ДНР, ЛНР, Запорожскую и Херсонскую области через территорию России. Однако такие возможности ООНовцы не используют. Почему секретариат ООН так легко находит слова, когда нужно поддержать западную версию событий, и так мучительно подбирает выражения, когда нужно назвать украинский удар по детям преступлением? Почему одни жертвы заслуживают немедленного сострадания, а другие нет? Почему гибель несовершеннолетних в одном месте становится поводом для громких заявлений и осуждений, а гибель детей в Старобельске встречает молчание? Вот вам очередное яркое проявление двойных стандартов и лицемерия Запада. Однако этот террористический акт не мог остаться и не остался безнаказанным. Господин председатель, 24 мая вооруженные силы России нанесли массированный удар по объектам военного управления, авиабазам и предприятиям оборонно-промышленного комплекса Украины с применением ракет «Орешник», «Искандер», «Кинжал», «Циркон», крылатых ракет воздушного, морского и наземного базирования, а также ударных БПЛА. Среди пораженных целей в Киеве и Киевской области были объекты украинского военно-промышленного комплекса, военной инфраструктуры, пункты управления Главного командования сухопутных войск, Главного управления разведки Минобороны Украины и другие пункты управления ВСУ. Удары по объектам гражданской инфраструктуры Украины не планировались и не осуществлялись. Этот удар возмездия в украинской столице является прямым следствием целенаправленных шагов по разжиганию конфликта со стороны Зеленского и его кураторов. Террор против мирных россиян, которых Киев при одобрительном молчании своих подельников на Западе уже давно превратил в инструмент ведения войны, мы и впредь без ответа оставлять не будем. Тем более, что циничный теракт в Старобельске далеко не единичный случай. Только за прошлую неделю в результате атак боевиков киевского режима погиб 51 мирный житель, и еще 199 человек, в том числе 20 детей, получили ранения. Это не сухая статистика, а человеческие жизни, женщины, дети, пожилые люди. За тот же период по гражданским объектам, в том числе по жилым кварталам, школам, больницам на территории России, было выпущено свыше 4300 беспилотников, в том числе по Москве и Подмосковью. Обращаю ваше внимание, что в сложившихся условиях вооруженные силы России продолжают последовательное нанесение системных ударов по предприятиям украинского ВПК в Киеве, включая конкретные места проектирования, производства, программирования и подготовки к применению дронов, используемых киевским режимом при содействии натовских специалистов, ответственных за поставки комплектующих, предоставление разведданных и целенаведения. Удары будут наноситься и по центрам принятия решений, и по командным пунктам. Поскольку вышеуказанные объекты рассредоточены по всему Киеву, мы предупредили иностранных граждан, включая персонал дипломатических миссий и представительства международных организаций, о необходимости как можно скорее покинуть город, а жители украинской столицы не приближаться к объектам военной и административной инфраструктуры режима Зеленского. Повторим то, о чем мы говорили ранее неоднократно. Наши вооруженные силы не бьют по мирным жителям и гражданской инфраструктуре. Мы наносим удары исключительно по объектам, связанным с военным управлением, производством вооружений, размещением техники, логистикой и энергетическим обеспечением военной машины и инфраструктуре, используемой в интересах украинских вооруженных формирований. Господин председатель, события последней недели красноречиво показали: ни главарь киевского режима, ни его спонсоры к предметному диалогу по перспективам мирного урегулирования с нашей стороной не только не стремятся, но и делают все для эскалации противостояния. Дежурные воззвания к безусловному перемирию являются лишь прикрытием для продолжения Киевом их террора. Так называемые лидеры Европы таким образом лишь поощряют и без того безрассудный и самоубийственный настрой Зеленского. тональности их комментариев не оставляет сомнений в том, что Украину они окончательно и бесповоротно списали, вновь пытаясь выиграть время для своей безумной подготовки к войне с Россией, как они говорят. Они готовы дальше выжимать из многострадальной страны по максимуму, ее руками воюя с Россией до последнего украинца. При этом циничные светочи демократии, чтобы не отвечать за зло и хаос, который они продолжают сеять, принялись по полной демонизировать и очернять Россию. Западная пропагандистская машина денно и ночно работает лишь для того, чтобы переложить на нашу страну ответственность за последние действия цивилизованных, так называемых цивилизованных государств на Украине. Скажу сразу, выйти сухими воды у них не получится. За свои безумные и хищнические действия в отношении и России, и Украины они понесут неотвратимую ответственность. Очевидно, что без военного давления никакие призывы к реальной дипломатии не сработают. Наши вооруженные силы продолжат выполнение целей специальной военной операции по денацификации и демилитаризации Украины до полного устранения угроз безопасности, исходящих с ее территории. Благодарю вас.
感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。我现在以中国代表的身份发言。我感谢古特雷斯秘书长的发言和基亚利助理秘书长的通报。中方注意到基辅遭到的袭击的报道，对袭击造成平民伤亡深表关切。任何情况下，平民都不应该成为袭击目标。 平民的安全应该得到保护。中方谴责任何针对无辜平民的袭击。乌克兰危机持续延宕，近来地面形势非但没有得到缓和，反而愈演愈烈，不断发生新的平民伤亡，令人痛心。过去10天，安理会3次举行乌克兰问题会议，我们一次次目睹战火的蔓延，战争的残酷。 这样的局面不应再继续下去。中方呼吁当事方保持最大程度的冷静克制，以和平为重，以人民为重，停火止战，严格遵守国际人道法，停止攻击平民和民用基础设施，推动战场局势尽快降温，化解危机，争取和平，保护平民，最根本的 是通过对话谈判消弭冲突。和平之路尽管崎岖，但对话总比对抗好，和谈总比战争强。中方支持一切致力于和平的努力，希望有关各方早日恢复接触，继续谈判，相互展现政治意愿，重视并解决彼此合理安全关切。 在充分完全遵循联合国宪章原则基础上，消除危机根源，争取达成全面、持久、有约束力的和平协议。在乌克兰问题上，中方始终主张各国主权和领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守，各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视。 一切有利于和平解决危机的努力，都应该得到支持。中方将继续以习近平主席提出的4个应该为根本遵循，同国际社会一道，为推动和平曙光早日到来、危机早日实现政治解决，做出不懈努力。谢谢。我现在继续行使安理会主席的职能。 我现在请乌克兰代表发言。
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank the Chinese presidency for convening this meeting and express my gratitude to the delegations of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, and the United Kingdom for supporting Ukraine's request. I'm especially grateful to the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for your presence today in this chamber. It is a powerful signal that Russia's war of aggression will remain as a priority on the agenda of the UN and will not disappear until Ukraine has restored its territorial integrity. I'm also thankful to the distinguished briefer, ASG Khaled Kari, for clearly demonstrating once again to this Council a new shocking level of Russia's aggression against Ukraine by committing outrageous war crimes and crimes against humanity against the civilian population. These testimonies and these horrific facts that we just heard will form part of the evidence that will underpin future trials against Russian war criminals and help endure accountability for their every atrocity they committed in Ukraine. Mr. President, before proceeding with my statement, I feel compelled to set the record straight regarding yet another propaganda narrative promoted by the Russian representative today and repeatedly over the last few days concerning the so-called incident in Starobilsk, a fake story that is already collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. At last Friday's emergency meeting, Mr. Nebenza told this council of, and I quote, 86 students aged 14 to 18 and repeatedly referred to sleeping children, minors, and the deliberate killing of minors. I was listening very attentively to his passionate speech. I always listen to you, Mr. Nebenza. Unlike you, I don't scroll my smartphone to demonstrate disrespect. The Russian representative used the word children 15 times when speaking about Starobilsk last time. Today, Mr. Nebenza mentioned poor children 5 times at least. He even invited last time 2 UN bodies specifically mandated to protect children's rights, UNICEF and the special representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. Yet the very next day, the Russian Federation's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a list identifying the 21 alleged victims by name and date of birth, a list, it must be stressed, that has not been independently verified. But even according to that list that we see, every single individual named was an adult. Remarkably, not a single one was a child. In other words, the same institution that sends the Russian representative to sit in this chamber has, through its own documentation, which is unverified, I have to underline it once again, refuted his central claim. This tells us everything we need to know about the credibility of Starobilsk fake legend. I also have to say that it exposes Moscow's willingness to exploit children's rights and misuse UN institutions in the service of its propaganda. What is perhaps even more striking is that Russia expects the world to take all its accusations on faith, while its own version of events starts falling apart the very next day as it was presented. Here is another example. On 22nd of May, Mr. Nebenza told this council that the Ukrainian army, and I quote, used 4 fixed-wing drones. But just 4 days later, at the press conference on the 26th of May, the same representative of Russia told reporters that 16 UAVs targeted the same location in 3 successive waves, end of quote. So we see that imaginary number of alleged drones suddenly quadrupled in 4 days. I could continue deconstructing and dismantling the endless stream of Russia's lies, but I value precious time of this council far too much to devote any more of it to this exercise. Mr. President, the Starobilsk narrative is a textbook example of cynical Russia's propaganda, a construct so evidently fabricated that it is effectively stitched together with white threads of lies and drawn out of thin air. We are seeing yet another attempt by the Russian Federation and by the broader machinery of Mr. Putin's system of disinformation to cynically invent and construct a new victimhood narrative. Through a mixture of falsehoods, manipulations, and deliberate distortions, Russia is trying to fabricate yet another myth of Starobilsk, portraying itself as an alleged victim of this war. But let me be absolutely clear. We cannot allow this to happen, because this is not about the victims of war. The sole responsibility for those victims of war lies with a single individual, Mr. Putin, and the military monster that he commands. What is being pursued instead is something far more dangerous, an attempt to manufacture Moscow's justification for an ongoing act of brutal aggression against Ukraine, or for the so-called retaliation. And we have seen this pattern before, like fabricated myths about 2014 tragedy at the trade union house in Odessa, or cynical narratives about an alleged people of Donbass supposedly targeted by Ukrainian forces, both fake constructs that Moscow keeps recycling over and over again. All of this has been instrumentalized by a cynical propaganda apparatus to justify Russia's war crimes and crimes against humanity, including the mass killings and indiscriminate strikes against civilian populations that we witnessed in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities last Sunday. It was Pentecost Sunday. To be frank, watching the sheer zeal, this almost theatrical determination with which the Russian representative at the UN beats his chest and bends every possible effort to manufacture the new Russian myth of alleged victimhood is deeply disturbing. I want to reiterate once and for all, the armed forces of Ukraine target only legitimate military objectives in full accordance with international humanitarian law. We never target civilians. Mr. President, let me now turn back to my statement. The night from the May 23rd to May 24th in Kiev, my native city was hit, without exaggeration, with a strike which can be compared to a true Armageddon. It was the most devastating assault the Ukrainian capital has endured since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion. Waves of Russian deadly missiles and drones struck the city with a new appalling level of brutality, leaving no doubt about Mr. Putin's true intention, not military necessity, but maximum terror inflicted on the metropolis and Ukraine's peaceful citizens. I'm raising this issue with the members of this council also with a deep personal pain. As you know, my own family lives in Kiev. They too went through that hellish night of Russian barbarism unleashed by Mr. Putin and his henchmen dressed in military uniform. Thanks God, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my 10-year-old niece, they survived this horror night. But survival is not something that we Ukrainians can take for granted. It is difficult to convey how absurd this reality sounds today in the 21st century, in the very heart of Europe, in one of the most beautiful European capitals with over 3 million inhabitants. On Whit Sunday, Russian armed forces, as we just heard, carried out one of the largest and the most terrifying combined attacks on Ukraine's civilians and civilian infrastructure, using 54 cruise missiles, 32 ballistic missiles, including 2 Kinzhal air-launched missiles, as well as 3 Zircon hypersonic missiles. In addition, over 600 Russian attack drones were employed against civilian population. Many of them were Shahed-type drones, the same Iranian-designed deadly weapons that have shown their destructive power also now in the Middle East and in the Gulf region, used by Iranian armed forces. Over 100 people were injured across Ukraine, and at least 4 of them were killed. Severe damage, as we also heard, has been reported across all districts of Kiev, affecting a wide range of civilian objects. Exactly speaking, 352 residential buildings were among the hardest hit, including high-rise apartment blocks, private houses, many of which sustained fires, structural damage, or partial destruction. A whole section of a residential building on Degtярivska Street was demolished from the 1st to the 5th floor. The family of our friends lived in that building. Thankfully, they survived the strike but lost their apartment and all their possessions. The Chernobyl Museum, and we heard this already, was completely destroyed by a direct missile strike. It had been reopened just less than months earlier, following long reconstruction, marking the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. The Russian barbaric barrage also struck a number of Ukrainian cultural institutions, including the National Art Museum of Ukraine. It is our Louvre, or our Metropolitan Museum, the National Philharmonic Hall, the National Music Academy, the Kyiv Municipal Academy Opera and Ballet Theater, the Yaroslav the Wise National Library, the International Center for Culture and Arts, the Ukrainian House Center, and many others. Historic architectural landmarks of our capital, including the Contracts House in Podil district where I live, and the Central Postal Station building, were also damaged. 19 schools and educational institutions in Kyiv were severely affected by Russian airstrikes, including the historic campus of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, one of the oldest national universities, alongside a public food market, shopping malls, office centers, and warehouses. The blast struck also the building of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a unique architectural masterpiece erected in 1939 that sustained damage for the first time since the Second World War. The Cherkasy, Kharkiv, Kropyvnytsky, Odessa, Poltava, Sumy, and Zhytomyr regions were also targeted by Russia in that fateful night of May 24. Mr. President, colleagues, allow me to reiterate once again that despite Russia's constantly repeated claims that it does not target Ukraine's civilian population, even the main Kremlin propagandist Vladimir Solovyov a few days ago openly admitted that this is a pure lie. In one of the recent broadcasts, this Kremlin mouthpiece acknowledged that over the past weekend, Russia carried out indiscriminate strikes against Kyiv and that its military command makes no distinction between military and civilian targets because, as he literally put it, Russian bombs and missiles have no eyes. For years, Mr. Putin has been shamelessly lying that Russian troops only strike military objectives, yet now even its own official propaganda machinery finally concedes that Russia does kill indiscriminately. And now we hear something even more revealing. These threats are no longer voiced only by Russia's military command. They are now being openly articulated by the Russian Foreign Ministry itself, that turn into the most aggressive and brazen megaphone of war in human history, even trespassing the Third Reich. We are told explicitly that Russia only strikes what it calls, and I quote, decision-making centers and command posts. So let us throw a closer look at the results of the latest massive missile attack on Kyiv. One of the sites completely destroyed was the famous Lukyanivka fruit and vegetable market, an ordinary marketplace near the neighborhood where my family used to live for years. So is Mr. Putin waging a war against Ukrainian tomatoes, or maybe our cucumbers and parsley? Mr. President, now let us throw a closer look at the tremendous cost of this latest brutal missile and drone attack on Kyiv. Based on open source calculations, the price that Mr. Putin has paid for this last barbaric attack is about $360 million US. Just imagine the scale of this absurdity. The figure reflects only the value of weapons used within a 7-hour strike in that night. When translated into real-life terms inside the Russian Federation, the scale becomes even more astonishing. According to official Russian construction cost benchmarks, this sum could finance approximately 35 modern schools or 12 fully equipped modern hospitals. In other words, the value destroyed by Russia in just one single night, attacking the very first McDonald's cafe in Kyiv, by the way, it was already reopened, could have been converted into many decades of public investment in social infrastructure, dozens of schools educating a few generations of children, and hospitals providing essential medical care. $360 million US is comparable to the entire annual budgets of such medium-sized Russian cities as Kursk, Bryansk, or Belgorod. Mr. President, at our previous meeting, I reminded Council members that around 35 million people in Russia still do not have access to proper sanitation and sewerage services, a striking reality for a country that claims great power status. Had the Kremlin chosen to invest $360 million US it wasted in this one single night on fruit markets in Kiev, in its own people in Russia, that amount would have been sufficient to build a state-of-the-art sewerage and wastewater treatment system for a city of 300,000 residents. Moreover, in human terms, with an average Russian pension of roughly $260 per month, this amount would cover the annual pensions of 110,000 pensioners. But instead, Mr. Putin decides to invest $360 million into missiles that launched in one night against the European capital, destroying a vegetable market, a coffee shop, which, as we just heard, was also reopened next morning, and many other command centers in Kiev. Now we also know that Russia has deployed a medium-range ballistic missile known as Oreshnik, which is capable of carrying nuclear warheads. It was used primarily as an instrument of intimidation against the international community. So let me also highlight the sheer absurdity of this action. The cost of a single Oreshnik missile is around $50 million. Russia launched at least two of them. One reportedly lost its course and fell on the temporary occupied territory in the Donetsk region. The other reached the area near Bila Tserkva, just outside Kiev, where it detonated in the air. And if one assumes that the intended target was the so-called decision-making center, then the result of this precision strike, Mr. Nebenza, was the destruction of a few old garages in a garage co-op, as well as an old fence on the outskirts of Bila Tserkva. This is yet another clear illustration of how Mr. Putin is recklessly squandering billions of dollars on weapons that achieve no military effect, while these enormous resources could have been and should have been used for the benefit of his own population. But who cares about ordinary people in Russia? Mr. President, we are closely monitoring Russia's activities aimed at further involving Belarus in aggression against Ukraine. This is another disturbing issue and another new threat that I would like to turn the attention of this Council. The Lukashenko regime has effectively surrendered its sovereignty, allowing its territory, military infrastructure, and airspace to be used by Moscow. Under growing Kremlin pressure, Belarus is being pushed toward deeper involvement in the war, including through mobilization measures, deployment of advanced missile systems, and nuclear-related exercises, thereby posing a new, unprecedented threat not just to Ukraine, but to European security. Ukraine hopes that Belarus will not start an invasion from its soil. But there should be no doubt that Ukraine will defend itself in strict accordance with Article 51 of the Charter. Any attack from the north will trigger an immediate and decisive response, and the regime in Minsk will face devastating consequences. We therefore urge the Security Council to increase pressure on both Moscow and Minsk to prevent this new escalation of war. Mr. President, to conclude, first, Ukraine calls again on our European and our American partners to multiply their air defense assistance at least tenfold. The alarming new scale of Russia's aerial terror requires a response of an entirely different magnitude. We need to better protect the skies over our cities. We need to better protect and save civilian lives. Second, we once again urge all UN member states to take robust unilateral measures to deprive Russia's war machine of its financial lifeline. Every loophole that remains open, every sanction left unenforced, and every source of revenue left untouched enables the Kremlin to prolong its war of aggression. Third, I would like to appeal to the members of this Council, an appeal that I have repeated at every single meeting for the past year. It is time for the Security Council to pass a resolution demanding an immediate, unconditional ceasefire, as well as the release of all prisoners of war and all unlawfully detained civilians under an all-for-all exchange formula. And last but not least, it is time to find an elegant but effective way to deprive Russia of its permanent seat of the Council, which it obtained, or better to say hijacked, under very dubious legal grounds. Mr. President, Russia is bending over backwards to portray itself as the victim of a war that it alone chose to start. The Kremlin is desperately trying to shift attention away from its aggression and to present the consequences of its own criminal actions as somebody else's responsibility, like in Starobilsk. But the reason for Moscow's panic is clear. Ukraine's deep strikes against legitimate military targets are not only changing the dynamics on the battlefield, they are inevitably eroding Russia's economic ability to sustain its criminal war machine. So I would like to give an advice to Mr. Nebenza, traditionally in Russian. Не бомбите и не бомбимы будете. Из народного послания к болотянам. Don't bomb, and you will not be bombed in return. I thank you.
感谢乌克兰代表的发言。俄罗斯代表要求再次发言，我现在请他发言。
Господин председатель, я всегда очень внимательно слушаю украинского паспреда, даже когда я использую смартфон, который я использую не для компьютерных игр, а по деловым нуждам. Я думаю, что вряд ли он может обвинить меня в обратном. Я всегда присутствую на его выступлениях. Не могу сказать, что я испытываю удовольствие, слушая его, но тем не менее я никогда не покидаю зал, пока я его не выслушаю. Сегодня речь идет не о сарказме и иронии, которая переполняла паспреда Украины. Речь идет о другом, что все это выглядело как достаточно жалкая попытка оправдать то, что произошло в ночь на 22 мая в Старобельске. Обратите внимание, украинский паспред не отрицал того, что там погибли люди, но его аргумент был в том, что это были не дети, это были взрослые люди. Это совсем другое дело, не правда ли? Ну уж его слова насчет сфабрикованного нарратива по поводу сожжения 45 человек в Одессе в мае 2014 года, это, конечно, находится за гранью. Вообще все это выступление, украинский паспред любит русские поговорки, и я тоже позволю себе употребить одну, что это все выглядело как в русской поговорке «на варе и шапка горит». Никакое жонглирование цифрами, которые он употреблял, не могло испортить этого впечатления. Мы не состоим в прямой переписке с украинским паспредом, хотя я могу направить ему письмо напрямую, где я изложу факты о том, что реально произошло в Старобельске, и свидетельства тех людей, которые это видели своими глазами. Но если он не готов принять такое письмо от меня, я сделаю так, что он до него дойдет другими путями, через механизмы, которые предусмотрены как в Совете Безопасности, так и в Генеральной Ассамблее. Ждите ответа. Благодарю вас.
感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。我现在请波兰代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank China for convening this urgent Security Council meeting in response to the latest escalatory chapter in Russia's aggressions against Ukraine. We also thank Secretary General for his presence in this briefing, and of course the ADG Chiari for his briefing. Mr. President, unable to achieve decisive battlefield results after more than 4 years of the war, Russian leadership has once again resorted to deliberate intimidation of civilians, revealing not strength but growing desperation. Poland strongly condemns the barbaric Russian attacks on Kyiv on May 24th. Targeting civilian areas and infrastructure is unacceptable. Russia's latest mass attack, including was just been confirmed today by the Russian delegation, including the use of the Oresh nuclear-capable ballistic missile against homes, schools, museums, and cultural institutions, constitutes an act of state terrorism, plain and simple. None of these targets were either legitimate or incidental. This is a pure terror. And if Russia, as it claims, are targeting military objects, but in fact hitting schools, that may be even more disturbing. The severe damage inflicted on more than 10 cultural, educational, and religious institutions represents not only the physical destruction, but the direct assault on the Ukrainians' heritage and identity. It is a clear violation of the commitments undertaken by Russia under the UNESCO Constitution and was rightly condemned by the UNESCO's statement. We need principled international response, one that ensures full accountability in accordance with international law. Mr. President, we continue to hear from Russia, including in this Council, that is conducting the so-called special military operation. It is clear that it is not the case. What Russia has been carrying out is an illegal war of aggression, and it's not limiting itself to military targets instead of attacking indiscriminately. Moreover, Russia has openly announced sustained and systematic attacks against Kiev, while at the same time calling on foreign nationals, including diplomatic personnel, to leave the city immediately. Such threats are unacceptable, and specifically as they are repeated in this very Council today. Threatening embassies and diplomats constitutes a flagrant violation of one of the most fundamental international treaties, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. The international community cannot ignore this conduct. Russia's unlawful actions further undermine its credibility as a permanent member of this Council. It continued a blatant disregard for the fundamental principles of the UN Charter, and it's shameful. Regrettably, we see no indication that Russia is prepared to engage in genuine peace process. Instead, attacks aimed at spreading fear and despair are intensifying. Mr. President, if we allow terror to pass without consequence, we erode the very foundations of this Council and of the United Nations. Accountability is not an optional, it's essential. We call on Russia to immediately cease its unjustified and unlawful aggression and to comply fully with its international obligations. Thank you.
感谢波兰代表的发言。我现在请罗马尼亚代表发言。
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Romania aligns with the statement of the European Union. I would like to thank the Secretary General for his clear message in favor of peace. Mr. President, we strongly condemn Russia's latest appalling attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Just last week, the majority of those speaking in the Council insisted once again for a ceasefire and a just and lasting peace. The combined missiles and drones attack on the night of 23rd, 24th of May was one of the largest and most devastating recorded to date against Ukraine and its capital city, Kyiv. The reported use of an Orezhnik intermediate-range nuclear-capable ballistic missile in Russia's latest attacks, for the third time since the start of the invasion, as we heard from Eiji Chiari, is a dangerous escalation and a matter of concern for international security and stability. As heard also from the briefers today, these indiscriminate attacks have again killed and injured innocent people. Residential areas were among the hardest hit. We reiterate our heartfelt solidarity with Ukraine and its people in these difficult moments. The deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, once again, is unacceptable and must stop immediately. President, the threats issued by the Russian Foreign Ministry to foreign embassies and foreign diplomats to leave Kyiv represent a serious and irresponsible escalation violating international law. We will not be intimidated and we will maintain our diplomatic presence in Ukraine and Kyiv. The real intent behind such escalations and threats is to scare and to coerce. This reflects an incremental pattern of deliberate intimidation, accompanied by misleading narratives blaming European countries. It also includes unacceptable threats of the use of force against sovereign states, as we heard last week in this Council, involving a member of this Council, continued drone intrusions in the sovereign airspace of neighbors of Ukraine, and reckless attacks in the close proximity of Ukraine's border with these states, including my own country, Romania. We have registered already too many instances of irresponsible nuclear saber rattling since the start of its invasion, and we reject such threats. The status of permanent member of Security Council and of a nuclear weapon state requires the highest level of responsibility. We will stand with Ukraine and its people for as long as it is needed in their legitimate and resilient self-defense against the aggressor and in ensuring justice through relevant accountability mechanisms. President, our ultimate goal remains upholding the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. The open debate this week reinforced this loud and clear. We reiterate our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The aggression against Ukraine must cease. Russia must agree to an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire and to meaningfully engage in negotiations towards a just and lasting peace. And I would like to support the call of the Ukrainian President, the Ukrainian Ambassador, on the resolution of the Security Council to this effect. Thank you very much.
感谢罗马尼亚代表的发言。 我现在请芬兰代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. Civilians and civilian infrastructure have been repeatedly hit by Russia in its war of aggression against Ukraine for more than 4 years already. Last Saturday, civilians in Ukraine were looking forward to a night of rest and recuperation. Instead, they were driven from their beds and their homes by hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles launched in a massive aerial attack by the Russian Federation. In Kiev, it was one of the most devastating attacks during the Russian war of aggression. In addition to numerous civilian casualties, many residential buildings and schools, opera house, museum, and other institutions were hit. The Nordic countries strongly condemn Russia's escalating attacks against civilians and civilian objects, including civilian infra. They must cease immediately. The latest escalation comes amid an already rising number of civilian casualties. In April alone, at least 238 civilians were killed and 1,404 injured in Ukraine. The military escalation is coupled with escalating rhetoric by Russia, openly threatening not only civilians, but also diplomats and staff of international organizations in Kiev. Even before these threats, there have been several attacks against humanitarian actors in Ukraine, most recently against WFP's warehouse in Dnipro. The Russian airstrikes are making the delivery of humanitarian assistance increasingly difficult, if not impossible in some areas. Russia has already hit diplomatic premises as well. Moreover, Russian Federation appears to have used an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile in its attack last weekend. This missile is specifically designed to carry nuclear warheads. The repeated use of nuclear-capable missiles is yet another manifestation of the unacceptable military escalation and the policy of intimidation, both of which the Nordic countries firmly condemn. Mr. President, the scale and scope of Russia's attacks against civilians throughout the war leave no room for describing such attacks as anything other than blatant, calculated violations of international humanitarian law. It is time to put an end to the senseless destruction and suffering in Ukraine. The Nordic countries repeat our call for a full unconditional ceasefire, which would allow space for meaningful talks towards peace. The Nordic countries remain steadfast in our support to Ukraine and to a just and lasting peace based on international law, including the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
感谢芬兰代表的发言。我现在请立陶宛代表发言。
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states, and we also align with the statement of the European Union. In the early hours of 24 May, Kiev endured one of the largest and most devastating combined aerial assaults of Russia's full-scale war. The attack reportedly involved more than 90 missiles, including hypersonic ballistic missiles and over 600 drones. This attack has resulted in more than 100 civilian casualties. Residential buildings, schools, markets, cultural sites, and government facilities, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, were struck or damaged across all districts of the capital. The premises of the World Health Organization and the UN were among the buildings damaged in the attack. The hypocrisy of Russia in portraying its action is immeasurable. Just last Friday, Russia requested an urgent Security Council meeting to convey concerns regarding to what it described as an attack on civilians in an occupied territory of Ukraine. Throughout the week, Russia found it appropriate to bomb entire cities, while today Russia seeks to justify these acts from the seat of a permanent member of this council. Moreover, Russia is accusing countries that support Ukraine in its right of self-defense. the Baltic states reject all false claims. We strongly condemn Russia's horrific attacks on Ukraine and call on Russia to immediately cease its aggression. There can be no false equivalence between the aggressor and its victim. Russia alone is responsible for starting this war. We further highlight the efforts of the UN and international humanitarian agencies and workers in their commitment to assisting Ukrainian authorities and civilians facing this assault. Mr. President, attacking cities with nuclear-capable missiles and other explosive projectiles is a grave violation of international law and must not be treated as business as usual. Such cowardly attacks demand accountability. We invite all members of the international community to support the establishment of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, in line with the Council of Europe resolution on the Special Tribunal adopted on 15 of May. We will also continue to call for full accountability and implementation of the International Criminal Court arrest warrants issued against Russian political and military leadership, including Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, over allegations of involvement in the war crimes of child abduction during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As Russia continues to ignore the multiple calls for peace, including Resolution 2774, adopted by this Security Council, countless resolutions of the General Assembly, and the International Court of Justice decisions, it is time for Security Council to act. The Baltic states advocate for an immediate ceasefire to stop the violence, alleviate suffering, and to enable negotiations with the aim of achieving a just and lasting peace. We reiterate our determination to continue supporting Ukraine, its right to self-defense, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, in accordance with international law, including fundamental principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
感谢立陶宛代表的发言。我现在请欧盟驻联合国代表团临时代办萨姆松女士阁下发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the EU and its member states. The candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, align themselves with this statement. And I thank the Chinese presidency for convening this meeting. And I also thank you to the briefer, ASG, for your update. We also appreciate the presence and remarks of the Secretary General at the outset of this meeting. President, we convene today as a result of Russia's latest escalation in its unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine. Last Friday, we heard the Russian representative attempt to justify his government's actions with far-fetched stories of Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Its so-called special military operation was supposed to last for 3 days. 4 years and an estimated 1.3 million Russian casualties later, it has still not achieved its objectives. Russia does not allow the independent verification of the events in Starobilsk. It has consistently denied access to the temporarily occupied territories for all international monitoring mechanisms. There is no independent journalism in Russia and the occupied territories, let alone freedom of expression. The government shuts down much of the internet out of fear of its own citizens. If Russia wants us to believe its allegations, it needs to allow access to an independent investigation. Ukraine, by contrast, has systematically cooperated with international monitoring mechanisms, including the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, as well as OSCE and Council of Europe institutions. Russia's atrocities in Ukraine are credibly documented, while Russia does everything in its power to cover up the reality in the territory it controls. Frustrated by the lack of progress on the battlefield, it is increasingly resorting to massive aerial attacks against Ukrainian cities and their population. On Saturday night alone, Russia's attack caused more than 100 civilian casualties, a number which would be much higher if it was not for the formidable efforts of Ukraine's air defense. Among the buildings damaged by Russia's horrific attacks were religious and educational facilities, a wastewater treatment plant, international media outlets, the National Art Museum, the Chernobyl Museum, the Kiev School of Economics, and the Kiev Opera. The use of nuclear-capable Oreshnik missiles constitute another highly problematic escalation. Russia's repeated threats against foreign diplomatic representations in Kiev are totally unacceptable. Russia's hypocritical claims that it targets military objectives ring hollow once again. In recent days, Russia has further debased itself, hitting warehouses of WFP and UNHCR in Dnipro, killing 2 humanitarian workers and destroying millions of euros worth of humanitarian supplies for people on the front line of its war of aggression. And let me therefore repeat, international humanitarian law must be respected. All attacks against humanitarian personnel and objects, civilians and civilian infrastructure must cease. President, the EU supports a full, unconditional and immediate ceasefire, as well as a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with international law, the UN Charter and relevant UN resolutions. We are actively supporting diplomatic efforts to this end, and we once again urge all members of this Council to work with us in pressuring Russia's leadership to accept a ceasefire and finally engage in good faith. We must work together to bring Russia to the negotiating table. We have heard from Ukraine that they are ready. I also reiterate the EU's urgent call on Russia and Belarus to immediately ensure the safe and unconditional return of all unlawfully deported and forcibly transferred Ukrainian children, in line with the December resolution of the UN General Assembly. And we furthermore call for the complete exchange of prisoners of war and the release of all unlawfully detained persons. President, the EU stands in solidarity with its member states, and we reject Russia's disinformation campaign, supported by Belarus, following airspace violations in the Nordic-Baltic region. We strongly condemn Russia's threats of the use of force directed at Latvia and other countries in the region. Russia's aggression will not stand. Its attempted illegal annexation will not stand. Its leaders will face accountability for their failing attempt to change borders by force. And Ukraine can continue to count on our support for its sovereignty, for its independence, and for its territorial integrity, as it exercises its inherent right of self-defense in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. And I thank you.
感谢萨姆松女士阁下的发言。发言名单上没有其他人了，现在休会。